In this video, we're going to learn about the distance and midpoint formulas as well as the Pythagorean theorem. The first thing here is we have this formula for the midpoint, which is, x1 plus x2 over 2, y1 plus y2 over 2. Let's explain what we're even talking about here. The idea is that you have these 2 points here, x1 and y1, and the second point, x2, y2. And then you go ahead and connect them with a straight line, and you ask yourself, what is going to be the point that's exactly halfway along this line? That's this point here in the middle. We're going to call that the midpoint. And it turns out, in order to find the midpoint, it's as easy as just taking your x-coordinates and averaging them, and then taking your y-coordinates and averaging them, and that's going to give you your midpoint. So there's really nothing else to it here. Let's do a quick example. We want to find the midpoint between the points -1, 3 and 8, -7. So for my x-coordinate, I add up the two x-coordinates and divide by 2. And we can either leave that as 7/2, or we can write it as a mixed number 3.5, or as a decimal 3.5. They're all perfectly valid ways of doing it. For the second coordinate, we look at our y-coordinates here. 3 plus a -7 over 2 is a -4 over 2, which is just a -2 there. And so that means that the coordinates of my midpoint are 3.5 comma -2. And then we're done with the problem. So midpoint formula, really not too much involved there. You just follow the formula, you get your answer. The next formula we have here is something called the distance formula. And it looks a bit more complicated here. It's the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared, and then square root all that thing there. It's a little bit of a mess at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's not so bad. So I give you an example here. Find the distance between these 2 points. Notice how they're the same 2 points as previously. So my distance would be the square root. Now there's one thing that sometimes I see students don't realize, is that you can put the points in either order. So either point can be considered your first point, and either point could be considered your second point. You just have to make a decision there, and as long as you're consistent, you're not going to have any problems. So my second x, the way I've written it, is 8 minus my first x is -1. Be careful with our signs here. I'm going to square that answer, plus my second y minus the first y squared. And let's see here, 8 minus 1 is 8 plus 1 is 9 squared. And let's see, -7 minus 3 is -10. And then we're squaring that. That's going to be 81 plus 100. That's going to be the square root of 181. Now, if we could simplify this, we should. A lot of times we cannot simplify it, though. Also, you might put that in your calculator and get a decimal answer. But generally in math courses, we prefer that you don't do that, because if you're going to give me a decimal there, at some point in time you're going to stop writing, and that means you're going to have to round your answer. And if you rounded it, it means it is not the perfectly correct answer. It's just an approximation of the answer. And it really depends on what class you're in. If you're in like a engineering class, approximate answer is usually perfectly fine. In fact, maybe preferred. But in a math class, we like to have perfectly exact answers, and so this is the better way to write it. Now, in case you're wondering where that formula for the distance came from, it actually comes from the Pythagorean Theorem. And it's kind of funny is there are hundreds, if not thousands, of theorems out there in mathematics. In fact, there are many, many new theorems that created every year. Some are useful by a lot of people, some are only in very small fields. Regardless, there's tons and tons of theorems. And yet, it seems like, in my experience, the only theorem that people actually know about is the Pythagorean Theorem. So everyone's been, using this for a long time in their lives. And it says if you have a right triangle, then you're going to have a squared plus b squared is c squared. Now it turns out this theorem is actually a double theorem because it says that if you have a right triangle, then you're going to get a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And also, if you had a random triangle that happened to satisfy this equation, then you would know without ever even drawing it that it's a right triangle. So it is a double theorem. It goes both ways there. And if you're wondering how this gets to the distance formula, well, if you go ahead and take your points here, x1, y1, and you take your second point, x2, y2, and we're going to go ahead and kind of draw a little right triangle here. Well, if I ask you how long is this bottom side of this right triangle, well, that's going to be is how much did your x-coordinate change? That distance is x2 minus x1. And then how much is this side of my right triangle? Well, that's how much your y-coordinate changed. That's y2 minus y1. And how long is the hypotenuse here? Well, that's the distance we're looking for. So by the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared is c squared. The hypotenuse, there's d in this case. And if you just square root both sides, you can see this right here is how we get our distance formula. So since everyone knows Pythagorean theorem, everyone should now know the distance formula.